This is lesson 2 of the United Kingdom class. As a quick review from last week, the first 3 chapters of Samuel introduced us to Samuel as a young boy. He'd been brought to serve in the temple from a very young age. His mother brought him there and left him to serve in that capacity. The current high priest and judge is Eli. He has 2 sons who are wicked, yet they serve as priests. Their names are Hophni and Phinehas. We saw in chapter 2 that through a man of God and through young Samuel in chapter 3, God had revealed to Eli what was going to happen as a result of his son's wickedness and Eli's refusal to restrain them. That's what begins to unfold in chapter 4. As I did last week, I'll hesitate between sections so you can pause the audio or video and read that section if you haven't done so. The geographical setting, let me get going here. The geographical setting is where we were last week. The tabernacle is located in Shiloh at this time. And the first section is chapter 4. We're going to be covering chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 this evening. And chapter 4 is about a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. This battle takes place in the valley between Aphek and Ebenezer in the upper left-hand corner of the map on your screen. So if you haven't done so, you can stop right now and read all of chapter 4. And then I'll give you a few moments to do that. Then you can pause the recording, and then we'll cover the questions over that material. This first section is called the First Battle of Ebenezer. It covers chapter 4. The first question asks, how does Judges 3, verse 5, relate to the times of Samuel? Well, Judges chapter 13, verse 5. This account tells of an angel appearing to the wife of a man named Manoah. The angel tells her that she will have a son whom we know to be Samson. And verse 5 of that chapter, Judges chapter 13, says, "For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines." The Philistines were a seacoast people living along the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. When we open the book of Judges, at the end of chapter 3, we find that Shamgar killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Nearly 200 years later, Judges chapter 13, we read this statement that we just noted pertaining to Samson. Then when we get to chapter 13 in 1 Samuel, we're going to see King Saul going to battle against the Philistines, and they have 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. And we're told they had people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. So they were a formidable enemy for Israel going back to the days of Samson and even before. And this was Samson's time was probably somewhere around 40 years before the birth of Samuel. And then we see as we continue through the scriptures that the Philistines continued to be a problem for the Israelites for several centuries after King Saul. The last reference we have to the Philistines is in the time of Hezekiah, when we're told that he subdued the Philistines in 2 Kings chapter 18, and this would have been about 400 years after Samuel's time. So there's a lot of history between these nations. Question number 2 says, explain the situation found in this chapter in light of chapter 4, verse 9, and chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. It seems I must be missing something here, but it seems to me like this question is out of order. I'm going to answer it between question numbers 6 and 7. So we're going to move on to question number 3, which says, what was the result of Israel's first encounter with the Philistines? Well, quite simply, it didn't go very well. Verse 2 tells us that when they met together between Aphek and Ebenezer, that the Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. Question number 4 says, the elders of Israel could see that God was not with them, but did they understand why? And explain. Well, it seems apparent that they did not understand, and the way they handled the situation seems to make that clear. It seems they failed to grasp the idea that they could not live in disobedience to God and still count on Him to deliver them. There's a tragic irony in verse 4, where the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the camp, and then we're told that, quote, the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God, end quote. If the elders had insisted that Hophni and Phinehas stay away, maybe God would have fought for Israel. Just a thought, but they clearly were missing a major point here. Question number 5 says, explain the significance of the Ark of the Covenant and why Israel thought its presence would help them. It says verse 4 compared with Exodus 25 verses 10 through 22. Well, Exodus 25 verse 22, God speaking through Moses says, there above the cover between the two cherubim that are over the Ark of the Covenant, I will meet with you and give you all my commands for the Israelites. Also, Numbers chapter 10 verse 35 says, whenever the ark set out, Moses said, rise up, Lord, may your enemies be scattered, may your foes flee before you. Passages like these and others made it clear that God's presence was connected with the Ark of the Covenant. But the Israelites were missing an important component. We've already hinted at that, or maybe more than hinted, but we're going to deal with that in the next question as well. Question number 6 says, what superstitious misconception of the ark was held by the people? Well, it seemed that they viewed the ark as a talisman or as a good luck charm. And then the next question in chapter 6 is there a lesson to be learned from this? Well, I think so. And I think the lesson is that we all need to be careful not to find ourselves thinking that because we read our Bibles, because we prepare for Bible classes, because we attend services, because we partake of the Lord's Supper and other scriptural things, and because we identify ourselves by biblical terms, we need to be careful that we don't find ourselves thinking that those things can take the place of hearts submitted in humble obedience to God in our daily lives. And this is what seems to have been missing in the thinking of Israel at this time. Now I'm going to go back to question number 2. It says, explain the situation found in this chapter in light of chapter 4 verse 9 and chapter 7 verses 13 and 14. Well, chapter 4 verse 9 says, this is the Philistines speaking among themselves. It says, be strong and conduct yourselves like men, you Philistines, that you do not become servants of the Hebrews as they have been to you. Conduct yourselves like men and fight. Chapter 7 verses 13 and 14 tells that when the Philistines were subdued by Israel, and they did not come any more into the territory of Israel. This was a couple of decades later. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Then the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered its territory from the hands of the Philistines, and there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Again, I apologize if I missed something, but it seems to me that the text explains itself quite well regarding the question. The question was, explain the situation found in this chapter in light of that statement in chapter 4, verse 9. When the Philistines learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, chapter 4, verses 7 through 9 says, they were afraid, and they said, a god has come into the camp. Nothing like this has happened before. Verse 8 says, we're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. Question number 7 says, what is meant by the order, conduct yourselves like men? Well, again, that statement was made by the Philistines. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. New Living Translation says, stand up like men and fight. The Contemporary English Version says, fight and don't be afraid. It simply means don't give in to fear. It means be courageous. It means act like men. Question number 8 says, list the effects of the battle. Verses 10 and 11 says that Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers, and that the ark of God was captured, and both of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. And we recall that this began the fulfillment of the prophecy made by the man of God in chapter 2, particularly verse 34, which is where he says, what happens to your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. And so after the battle with the Philistines, a messenger was sent to tell the people of Israel what had happened. And in verses 16 through 18, when Eli heard that the ark had been captured, we're told that he fell backward off his chair, and his neck was broken, and he died. Question number 9 says, why was Ichabod an appropriate name for a son born at this time? Well, because the name Ichabod means no glory or inglorious. Verses 20 through 22 makes it uncertain as to who actually named the child. The reading of the text seems to indicate that the mother already died and one of the women helpers named the baby, but regardless, you can see why the name was appropriate. Verses 21 and 22 says, she named the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. That's verse 22. Question number 10 says, what would this battle show about the Ark of the Covenant? Well, it would show that the ark was, again, not some kind of good luck charm. That the nation of Israel could not simply call on God when they were in a bind and expect him to answer their call regardless of how the people of Israel were behaving. So I'll pause again as we prepare for the next section if you'd like to read chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. So chapter 5, question 11 says, what did the Philistines do with the Ark of the Covenant? So they've captured it in the previous chapter, and we're told in chapter 5 that they took it to Ashdod, which was one of their 5 major cities, and they put it in the temple of Dagon, who was the Philistine national deity. The next question, part of question 11 was, what was the significance of their action? Well, the way they treated the ark was the way they were treating the God of the ark. And they thought that since they had won the battle against Israel, that their god, Dagon, was more powerful than the God of Israel. And so they were treating the ark, we might say, like a trophy. They were treating it as subordinate to their idol, Dagon. And then question number 12 asks, what was Dagon? Well, Dagon was the chief god of the Philistines. The Philistines believed that he controlled the weather, and that he was responsible for the fertility of the land. They thought worship of Dagon ensured a good crop. Many believed the name Dagon was likely derived from a word for grain, which would suggest that why he was associated with fertility and agriculture. However, Dagon is often depicted as a half-man, half-fish. Based on the Hebrew word, some insist that Dagon was a fish god, and they may also see a connection there with the fact that the Philistines were a seafaring people. When you do an internet search on Dagon, if you look for images or pictures, virtually all of them are pictures of Dagon as a half-man, half-fish, as you see on the screen. And the next question is, what happened to him? Well, when the Philistines put the Ark of God in the temple with Dagon, the next morning, verse 3 tells us that Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him in his place again. But the next morning the same thing happened. Dagon had fallen down before the ark of the Lord again. This time his head and hands had broken off and were lying in the doorway. Only the trunk of his body was left intact. And then the last part of question number 12 says, what was the significance of these things? Well, God was making it clear who was the only true God. God was putting the idol Dagon in a position of worship and prostration before the ark, which represented the true God Jehovah. Question number 13 asks, what else did God bring upon the Philistines? Well, in chapter 5, verses 6, 9, and 12, it mentions that God struck the Philistines with tumors. And this is considered to be the bubonic plague. Those different indicators there, verses 6, 9, and 12, are connected with the fact that they passed the ark around. As the plague came upon them, they took it to another one of the major cities. And so chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, 2, if you'd like to go ahead and read that, I'll pause here for a few minutes and let you do so. So question number 14 says, what trespass offering, or some translations say guilt offering, was sent by the Philistines? Well, verse 4 tells us 5 golden tumors and 5 golden rats were sent according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. And of course that makes us ask, what was the number of the lords of the Philistines? Well, there were 5 major cities. You see that on the map there, those to the left of Jerusalem: Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Ashkelon, and Gaza. 5 major cities of the Philistines. Each city had a king or a lord. And so they're offering these trespass offerings sort of as a unified group, the whole nation coming together, offering these. And question number 15 asks, how would rats be connected with the tumors? They're only mentioned in chapter 6 verses, well, first mentioned there in chapter 6 verses 4 and 5. Some versions, some translations have mice instead of rats. They're not mentioned in chapter 5 at all, but then they come in here with the golden tumors being, or the golden emblems of them, representing them being a factor. Well, it's likely that there was an infestation of rats, and that the rats were the carriers of the disease. Question number 16 says, how were some milk cows used to find out whether God was behind the plague on the Philistines? The simple explanation of that is given in chapter 6 verses 7 through 9. It says, now that they advise the people, get a new cart ready with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart, but take their calves away and pin them up. Take the ark of the Lord and put it on the cart, and in a chest beside it put the gold objects you are sending back to him as a guilt offering. Send it on its way, but keep watching it. If it goes up to its own territory toward Beth Shemesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it does not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us, but that it happened to us by chance. Well, the second part of that question says, how would that show whether or not God was involved? Well, I don't have a degree in cowology, but here's what I understand. There were several factors in this that made it extremely unlikely that the cows would pull this cart to Beth Shemesh. First of all, both these cows had never been yoked, so they'd never pulled a cart. Both cows had just had calves. And so it would go completely against nature for these cows to leave their calves and go off in some direction they've never been, pulling something they've never pulled, wearing yokes when they'd never been yoked. Some say that the cows lowing as they went, which is mentioned in verse 12, was them calling for their calves as they were walking away from them. It was very reasonable for these men to conclude that if the cows in fact behaved this way and took the cart to Beth Shemesh, it would be an act of divine intervention. The next portion of question 16 says, what was the outcome? Well, the cows went to Beth Shemesh, and the Israelites of that city rejoiced. The map that you see here starts at Shiloh, up here where the arrow is, and has the ark traveling this direction. That's just referencing the battle there at Apec, and we'll get into, well, I opened a door that I don't want to step through yet, but we'll talk about this in a minute, about what happened to Shiloh. But the ark is then taken down to Ashdod, to Gath, and to Ekron, and then we have it being released, and the cows pulling it to Beth Shemesh. And then after they have problems there, which we don't have any questions about that, so won't be looking at that in more detail, then it's sent to Kiriath Jearim. And so I'm sorry, I forgot what the question was. What was the outcome? Well, the cows went to Beth Shemesh, and the Israelites of that city rejoiced. And then verses 14 and 15 tells us that the cart came to the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh, and there it stopped beside a large rock. The people chopped up the wood of the cart and sacrificed the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Levites took down the ark of the Lord, together with the chest containing the gold objects, and placed them on the large rock. On that day the people of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and made sacrifices to the Lord. Question number 17 says, explain chapter 6 verse 19 in light of Numbers chapter 4 verses 5, 15, 19, and 20. Well, I might point out first of all that according to Beth Shemesh, Joshua 21 verse 16, according to Joshua 21:16, Beth Shemesh was a Levitical city, and there would have been Levitical priests there, but there were clear restrictions given regarding how to handle the ark of the Lord. Let me get something clear here before I press on. Oh, the wonders of the pause button. I had forgotten something and was getting a little twisted there. So let me go ahead and read chapter 6 verse 19, because the question is, explain chapter 6 verse 19 in light of Numbers 4, etc. And so verse 19 says, Then God struck the men of Beth Shemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. And it gives a little more information. The people lamented because the Lord had struck them with a great slaughter. I mentioned that Beth Shemesh was a Levitical city, and so there would have been Levite priests there. But there were clear restrictions given regarding how to handle the Ark of the Covenant, even by the priests. And this was disregarded, and they suffered the consequences. Question number 18 says, why was the ark not carried back to Shiloh? Well, based on other passages, it seems that the Philistines also destroyed the tabernacle and Shiloh after the battle at Ebenezer. This is what I was kind of hinting at a while ago, and just didn't go there when I was pointing out on the map the battle here, and perhaps the Philistines came on over and ransacked Shiloh and destroyed the tabernacle and so on, and that seems to be the case. And that regardless of the specifics, God had clearly abandoned Shiloh. Psalm 78 verse 60 says, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh. Several hundred years later, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, several hundred years after the events we're reading about here in 1 Samuel, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, God is condemning the people of Judah for their attitude toward God's temple. He reminds them of what he had done to Shiloh. In Jeremiah 7 verses 11 and 12, it's written, has this house which is called by my name become a den of thieves in your eyes? Behold, I, even I, have seen it, says the Lord. Then verse 12 says, but go now to my place which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at first, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. So that seems to perhaps be why the ark was not carried back to Shiloh and instead was taken to Kiriath Jearim, as you see on the map there. And it remained there until David later took it to Jerusalem. So we're going to pause again for the last section here, and if you'd like to read chapter 7, verses 3 through 17, we'll cover the remaining questions. Question number 19 says, what is meant by Ebenezer? Well, the word means stone of help. And the second part of that question says, what was the purpose of such a stone as Samuel erects? Well, we see stones set up at different times in Scripture. I'm sure you can recall some of them off the top of your head. They're used as memory devices when they're used in this manner. Like we might set up a memorial statue or historical markers. And so when people looked up on the stone, they were taught to remember the event connected with that stone. Then the third part of that question says, why was the stone called Ebenezer? Well, verse 12 answers that. It says, then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shin and called its name Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. And so the stone was a reminder that God had delivered them from the Philistines and actually had given them a great victory over the Philistines. Question number 20 says, what caused God to help Israel in the second battle since he did not help them in the first one? Well, because in the first battle they were using the Ark of the Covenant as a tool, again, as we said, as a good luck charm to help them win the battle. But in this instance, they turned their hearts to God in penitent prayer, and they relied upon him, and he responded. Question 21 says, explain the symbolism of verse 6, the pouring out of water, using the context and parallel passages such as, and it mentions 3 passages. Well, particularly in the Psalms and Lamentations passages, pouring out of water, as well as perhaps a few other passages in the Old Testament, pouring out water seems to be an act of contrition, an act of remorse. Psalm 22:14 says, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax, it has melted within me. Lamentations 2:19 says, arise, cry out in the night, as the watches of the night begin. Pour out your heart like water in the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands up to him for the lives of your children who faint from hunger at every street corner. Question number 22 says, what were the results of this battle? Well, verses 13 and 14 that we read earlier tell us that. It says the Philistines were subdued and they stopped invading Israel's territory. And throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines, and the towns of Ekron to Gath that the Philistines had captured from Israel were restored to Israel, and Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the hands of the Philistines. Question number 23 says, describe the judgeship of Samuel and where was his home? Well, his home was Ramah, and I'm not sure, let me see, I have that here on this map somewhere right there. So that's Ramah, there's Shiloh, and this seems to depict Ramah farther away. I mentioned last week that sometimes it's located 15 miles south of Shiloh and sometimes anywhere between and up to 5 miles. And so they have Ramah located down here, and that was Samuel's hometown. And it says, describe the judgeship of Samuel. We're told that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and then he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah. This is Bethel here. Mizpah is here, and Gilgal is here. So he made a circuit in this area, which is about a 50-mile ovalish yes, oval, semi-oval. Anyway, sorry. And so it's interesting that the whole nation seems to be looking to Samuel, but the local nature of judgeship in Samuel's time and in the other days of the judges as well, the local nature of judgeship in ancient Israel seems to subtly introduce us to the need for a king, which will be brought up next. And so we see in these first 7 chapters of Samuel, what we see there is the transitioning of the nation of Israel from a weak, unspiritual nation into a nation which seems to be seeking God. Had something spicy that just happened. The battery indicator came up and I had to shut things down real quick before I lost everything. I didn't plug in my power cord. But anyway, I was kind of a little squirrely there for just a moment, so I hope I wasn't too confusing. But I wanted to just say another thing or two. Um, Next week, we're going to look at chapter 8, and beginning in chapter 8, we will see another transition into the beginning of a monarchy with Israel's first king, King Saul. And so next week's lesson is lesson number 3, and it covers chapters 8 through 12.